Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. It is that time of week again where I read an article that I want to respond to. Now I know other people tend to respond to videos, but I don't watch a lot of videos. So I think this is becoming my thing, reading an article and responding to it. The article that caught my attention this week was titled, Suze Orman once warned $2 million is nothing when it comes to retirement savings. Now, this is a hard sentence to stomach because having $2 million invested, excluding your home equity, puts you in the top 8% of all Americans. If you want to go ahead and include home equity, it still puts you in the top 10% of all Americans. So to say that it's nothing seems like a bit of a stretch. Now, because I do believe that sometimes articles can be notorious for taking things out of context, I did want to dig up where she actually said this. And it turns out it was on a podcast called Afford Anything and done back in 2008. And she was actually speaking about retiring early or the FIRE movement. So not looking at a traditional retirement age, but it turns out her stance is pretty dramatic.
$2 million is nothing. It's nothing. It's pennies in today's world. Listen, if you have 20, 30, 50, or $100 million, be like me, okay? If you have that kind of money and you want to retire, fine. But if you only have a few $100,000 or $1 million or $2 million, I'm here to tell you I doubt highly that when you no longer have a paycheck coming in and you've invested that money and maybe it's making some interest for you or dividends or whatever, if a catastrophe happens, if something goes wrong, what are you going to do? You are going to burn up alive.
And just in case that wasn't subtle enough, again, keep in mind that she is speaking about an early retirement. She adds, you can do it if you want to. I personally think it is the biggest mistake, financially speaking, you will ever make in your lifetime. Adding, if you don't have at least 5 million or 10 million, don't retire early. I love the subtlety of that message, and just in case that isn't translating, that is sarcasm, because those are really astronomically high numbers. Early retirement or not, a number in the millions is what people tend to say you need if you want to retire. In fact, according to Northwestern Mutual's Planning and Progress study, Americans think they'll need about $1.5 million in order to retire comfortably at a typical retirement age, not considering an early retirement. And it's safe to say that if we look at a typical retirement account balance, the typical American doesn't have anywhere near these amounts. I want to return back to Suze Orman for a moment and see where her numbers came from and see why she might suggest such lofty numbers. Think about it logically, she said. Supporting a disabled family member who needs full-time care could cost $250,000 a year. Ordinary cost of living would cost another $100,000 a year. This means you'll need $350,000 per year after taxes to cover your cost, which is about $500,000 per year before taxes, which at a 5% withdrawal rate means that you'll need a portfolio of $10 million. She also gave examples where your home was completely destroyed and you had to replace it, or if there were extreme tax hikes. Basically, she's giving the worst of the worst case scenarios. In the example she gave, she used a 5% rate of withdrawal, which I actually love because I tend to prefer a 5% rate of withdrawal over the traditionally said 4% rate of withdrawal. But again, that comes down to personal preference. I also love that she does consider the worst of the worst case scenarios, because if you're looking at retirement, and especially an early retirement, I do think it's best to be prepared. It's best to look at those worst case or most expensive scenarios that could happen. Isn't there some kind of saying about being prepared for the worst but hoping for the best? I think that's a good philosophy when it comes to your finances and stepping away from the workforce and not having a paycheck. You'd be prepared for those worst case scenarios if they ever come up, but hopefully the bad things never happen. Let's touch on her $500,000 figure for a moment. Taxes on a $500,000 income during your working years likely would bring that take-home pay to around $350,000, again, taxed as ordinary income. But if we're looking at $500,000 coming from investments, it's likely that you would experience some favorable tax treatment. Specifically, if you were to have investments that were held for longer than 365 days, turning them to investments subject to long-term capital gain tax, And if that was the case, that was applicable to this very wealthy early retiree with $10 million invested, that would cut their tax bill nearly in half based on the example that Orman gave. I do think she brings up a very interesting point when it comes to considering disabilities, because often disabilities aren't something we consider when we're young and vibrant and healthy and are in our peak working years. But the stats on it are kind of staggering. If you're under the age of 35, chances are 1 in 3 that you will be disabled for at least 6 months during the course of your career. Men have a 43% chance of becoming seriously disabled during their working years. Women have a 54% chance. And so often when we hear about a disability, we tend to think about an injury or an injury in the workplace. But these aren't the most common disabilities that creep up. Rather, it's something like a back injury or cancer or heart disease or some other medical event that takes you out of the workplace for a prolonged period of time. And I know I've mentioned this before on the channel, but I had a meningioma, a brain tumor that took me out of the workforce for nearly a year during the recovery process. And it's partly because of that event why I became such an aggressive saver and investor, because I became acutely aware of how suddenly life can change one Sunday morning. And that experience for me is a great reminder that disabilities don't discriminate. I was very young, very healthy. I was lifting weights several times a week. I was running 8 miles a day every single day, and still life had a way of blindsiding me. I say all of that to emphasize the point that I definitely think disabilities are something that you should plan for throughout your working career and throughout your life. You hope nothing ever happens, but it could. But let's get back to the original starting points of the video. The statement that $2 million is nothing. In today's world, it's basically pennies. That's an extreme take. And being that this interview was done about 6 years ago, she might consider that it's even less in today's world. The problem is, this is a very extreme statement, and I don't tend to like extreme statements because truly I think they do more harm than good. Statements like $2 million is nothing, or suggesting that you need an income of $500,000 during your retirement years, or you need to strive for account balances of $20, $40, $50, or $100 million in order to make an early retirement possible, don't make it possible. They make people want to throw their hands up and give up. And I think you have to believe that a lot of this narrative, a lot of these kind of statements are meant to trigger an emotion. They're meant to get you to click. Because if you look at the flip side, Orman herself is a big proponent of Fidelity's savings suggestions, saying if you're planning a traditional retirement at the age of 67, you would want to have 10 times your annual income saved up, and at this point, you'd be safe to step away from the workforce, which means that if you were, say, making $70,000 at the age of 67, you would need roughly $700,000 saved up in investments. And that's a pretty extreme difference between saying that someone needs to be some sort of decamillionaire in order to retire early. But I guess a lot of it depends on how early we're talking about retiring, because there's a big difference between retiring at, say, 35 than, say, retiring at 55. But it is worth keeping in mind that most people don't retire extremely early. In fact, only 1% of the population between the ages of 40 and 44 are retired. It's about 6% of 50 to 54-year-olds, and then takes a pretty big jump all the way up to 32% of 60 to 64-year-olds, continuing upward from there. But again, those are more traditional retirement ages as we continue on up. So what might the budget look like if you retired with $2 million invested? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to put the caveat out there that your home should be paid off. I really love the idea of going into retirement debt-free, keeping your debt burden as low as possible. And I think this becomes more important if you go into an early retirement. I don't see the point of retiring at, say, 45 if you're still paying down a mortgage. I would say keep working, get that home paid off before you retire, especially if it's an early retirement. Also, I know I said I love a rate of withdrawal of 5%, which I do for a traditional retirement, but if you're going to go with an early retirement, I do believe in being more conservative. As you get older, you can always increase your rate of withdrawal or adopt a more flexible rate of withdrawal, but if you're going to retire early, I like a conservative withdrawal rate, so I'd suggest something more like 3%. So if you have a $2 million investment portfolio, that's going to give you about $60,000 a year, or about $5,000 a month. Now, I certainly wouldn't call this lavish living, but it's absolutely possible depending on the region of the country you live in. It would likely be very possible in many parts of the Midwest, especially if your home is already paid off. And if your home is paid off, it doesn't mean you don't have any bills. Of course, you still have things like property taxes and utilities and other everyday life expenses. But still, this could be possible. Also, if this is coming out of an account subject to long-term capital gains tax and you're married filing jointly, there would be no federal tax burden, and your individual state taxes would come down to the state you live in. There are a few states that do not tax capital gains, whereas others do tax them, but again, they're taxed in a more favorable way than short-term capital gains or income. So safe to say, if you're investing for the long term, your tax burden would be minimal and the vast majority of the $60,000 income would be yours to work with. Again, $60,000 as an income isn't a lavish lifestyle in most parts of the country, but it is doable and it's nothing to scoff at. I think most of us would say if we could get $60,000 in passive investment income, that would be amazing. Could you retire early on $2 million? I bet you could make it work, and I bet there's headline stories about people who have been out there and have made it happen. I think if you're looking at stepping away from the workforce at an extremely early age, like say in your 40s, I think the bigger question to ask is what's the motivation behind this? Because if you find something that you enjoy doing, if you have a job that is rewarding to you, chances are you'll probably want to continue that. So maybe you involve yourself in more of a work transition rather than completely stepping away from the workforce. Just find something you like doing. And the general rule of thumb is probably that the earlier you want to retire, the more you would need in investments to make that a reality. The later you want to retire in life, the less you would need in investments to make that retirement work. And if you are interested in doing an early retirement and looking for ways to fund that without any penalties, I did recently do a video on just that I will link down below if you want to check it out. As always, thank you so much for watching. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. I love the subtlety of that message. Okay. Let's touch. Can't start. Don't know what's going on. I think I'm broken. Okay. Hey, considering that this lighting is really annoying today. I'm sorry about that. Stupid clouds.